Welcome back, everybody. So today we're going to have a look at a brand new video that's just been released. We have Michael Pillsbury and Peter Navarro, two heavy hitters in the White House. These people are extremely important, and what they say matters. So I suggest you grab some popcorn, grab your dinner, grab yourself a coffee or a drink, and sit down, because we're going to get into this. I'm actually interested to hear. This is actually relatively new. Yeah, well, October 2020, relatively new. It would still be relevant today, only a couple months later. Definitely very interested in what Peter Navarro has to say. Now, when you look at this video, 14,000 views, and it was streamed months ago. Now, see, look, Peter Navarro is the assistant to the president for trade and manufacturing. What he says and what is going to be said today, what we're going to watch, if you're investing, or you're worried about what's going to happen with your superannuation, or where you should put your money right now, these are the guys you listen to, because these are the guys that really pull the strings. So let's just get into it.
Well, hello, everyone. We have a real treat today here at Hudson Institute, a major address by the president's leading intellectual on China, who heads the Office of Trade and Manufacturing. He has a Harvard economics PhD, often refers to himself as someone who represents the blue-collar workers, but somehow he has that Harvard economics PhD on the side. He's the author of three best-selling books. One is The Coming China Wars in 2006 that I have here. I'm going to read a sentence or two from it in a minute. The second is Death by China. And the third, I think, was the best-selling of them all, Crouching Tiger. In all three cases, Dr. Peter Navarro was warning about China in very great detail, many years in advance of others and of this becoming a major national political issue. Many people say that China can never be predicted. We don't know what's going to happen next. So I want to show how Dr. Navarro's very early and prescient insight shows that's not true. Sometimes we do know things about China in advance.
Both these guys have been spot on. You can't really fault either of these guys. You can't really fault John Mearsheimer either. There's a reason why years ago I gravitated towards the Hudson Institute, because they just seem to be far more accurate than anybody else.
So on page 97 of The Coming China Wars, Dr. Navarro writes, China has become the world's prime breeding ground for new and exotic strains of influenza and other viruses, including both the deadly SARS virus and avian flu. The primary reason is that so many different animals live in such close proximity to humans and other species. And here's the punchline. The resultant cross-pollution creates a soup of chemicals and viruses that now threaten the world, with the possibility of a pandemic in which tens of millions of people may die. The only thing wrong with that is only 1 million have died so far, not tens of millions, but even that may come to be true. So ladies and gentlemen, I think Dr. Navarro is going to speak.
That's insane. He literally predicted what was going to happen. And that's not a Nostradamus type thing. He's just really intelligent.
And a major address that will be available online as well for about 35 to 40 minutes. And then we'll have 20 minutes of discussion and questions and answers afterwards. Dr. Navarro.
Thank you, sir. I'm honored to be back at the Hudson Institute, if only in virtual space. Unfortunately, these are the virtual times we live in. And at least one of the things I want to talk to you about today is the central role of communist China in bringing these difficult times upon America, upon the American president, and upon the rest of the world. let's not mince words here. Communist China is directly responsible for infecting our own nation and our president with a deadly virus that has put tens of millions of Americans out of work, inflicted trillions of dollars in economic damages, and has killed over 200,000 American souls. I call it Communist China because that's what it is. This is a country run by a dictatorial Chinese Communist Party with a mercantilist economy owned, controlled, and operated by the CCP for the purpose of plundering America and the rest of the world while enslaving ethnic and religious minorities within its own borders. The Hudson Institute is no stranger to such concerns. In fact, I chose the Hudson Institute for these remarks because within America's many think tanks, no people have thought more about the existential and mercantilist threats Communist China poses to America and the world than the scholars within these, at least for now, mostly virtual walls.
Yeah, by far the Hudson Institute has been the number one. Brookings loses its way. CSIS is a little bit, then you've got all, you've got all these other think tanks, and there's way too many of them. Hudson Institute has been, the gold standard for many years.
Let me begin these remarks then with some perspective on one of the most pivotal turning points in American history. In 2001, the year Communist China joined the World Trade Organization, the United States was still the center of the global manufacturing universe. While the passage of NAFTA in 1994 had already begun to erode targeted portions of our manufacturing base in industries like furniture and textiles, and in states like North Carolina and Michigan, over 17 million blue-collar men and women still worked in America's factories. Manufacturing employment represented nearly 15% of total employment, and the average wage of manufacturing workers was 50% above the national average. What followed after a predatory and mercantilist Communist China joined the WTO and proceeded to break all of the WTO's rules was nothing short of blue-collar carnage. Over the next 15 years, America would lose over 70,000 factories and more than 5 million manufacturing jobs. Also lost was the expertise of America's skilled craftsmen in machine toolmaking, electronics, shipbuilding, and other perishable skills critical to our manufacturing supply chain and defense industrial base.
Same in Australia.
By 2016, the last year of the Obama administration, total manufacturing jobs had fallen to 12.3 million, while manufacturing jobs as a percentage of total employment had been cut nearly in half to 8.5%. And over that 15-year period, real wages grew by only 3%. Not 3% per year, but 3% over the entire 15-year period. That's the wages of globalist sin. Wage stagnation, plain and simple. With this withering of America's manufacturing base and stagnation of blue-collar wages, families across our manufacturing communities, particularly across a Midwest swath that ran from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan to Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, were torn apart. As beautiful neighborhood homes dissolved into abandoned houses in the corrosive acid of globalism, the disintegration of families, along with depression and opioid addiction, would take a devastating human toll.
I covered fentanyl on this channel, by the way.
All of this
demonetized, of course.
Blue-collar carnage happened because politicians on both Capitol Hill and in the White House shoehorned Communist China into the World Trade Organization. Said Bill Clinton as he campaigned on behalf of Communist China in 2000, the WTO agreement would be, quote, the equivalent of a one-way street. Bill Clinton was absolutely right about that. He just got the direction wrong. For blue-collar America, China's entry into the WTO was an express lane right from the factory jobs of America to the sweatshops and pollution havens of Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou. If there's one thing in 2020 that is crystal clear, it is this: Donald J. Trump's economic nationalism has fundamentally changed America's understanding of the China threat. This Trumpian transformation in American attitudes about communist China is no accident. In fact, it may well be the political version of a Newtonian reaction to decades of communist China having its blue-collar carnage way with the American economy and manufacturing base. As a candidate in 2016, Donald J. Trump promised to stand up for American workers and put an end to China's economic warfare against the United States. Put an end to what I have referred to on numerous occasions as China's 7 deadly sins. By now, you may know the list: cyber hacking to steal our trade secrets, intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, mercantilist dumping, state-owned enterprise protectionism, currency manipulation, and 7, inundating our communities with enough deadly fentanyl and other opioids to kill over 50,000 Americans a year. Here, 2 things can be true about these 7 deadly sins at the same time. First, no president has done more to stand up to communist China than Donald J. Trump. But second, and despite the tough stance of President Trump, communist China has continued its aggression against America unabated and decidedly unabashed. This is what should be so concerning to every American. Despite President Trump's tough actions on China, this authoritarian, mercantilist, and ever increasingly militarized country seems more emboldened today than it was when our president took office. Just think about what President Trump has done in 4 short years to fight back against China's aggression to defend American workers. President Trump has imposed tariffs on over $350 billion Chinese products. In the interest of national security, he has imposed tough fines and sanctions on companies like ZTE and Huawei. He's banned mobile apps like TikTok and WeChat that can surveil and monitor American citizens, steal our data, and proliferate malware through our computer networks.
We still haven't done any of that. Huawei, yes, but WeChat? Top link in the description, guys, if you want to sign my petition to ban WeChat in Australia.
President Trump has also cracked down on China's brutal human rights abuses, from the concentration camps of Xinjiang province to the death of democracy in the streets of Hong Kong. Despite these tough actions, the Chinese Communist Party has continued its economic warfare against America and the world. As Attorney General Bill Barr has said, Communist China's goal is to raid, not trade. Equally disconcerting, the CCP is attempting to use its massive population and increasing military might to subvert and overthrow our rules-based international system. In these efforts, the CCP seeks nothing less than to replace America's arsenal of democracy with the CCP's own arsenal of dictatorship. The biggest victims of the CCP are the Chinese people themselves, forced as they are to live in an Orwellian workers' purgatory. Just think about the concept of a social credit score that shows how loyal a Chinese citizen is to the state. This Kafkaesque tool of repression is so repugnant that many Americans have a hard time believing that the CCP has even instituted such a credit score. Yet speak ill of a Communist Party leader and your social credit score goes down. Do it again and you'll lose your job. Do it again, it's off you go to a Chinese re-education camp. That's a marvelous euphemism, isn't it? Re-education camp. What exactly do you learn in these camps? How to use cattle prods on humans? How human beings can withstand the worst forms of torture and still somehow survive with dignity? And this was not how it was supposed to be. Politicians from Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger to the George Bushes, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama told us that if only we would economically engage, communist China would become more peaceful and democratic. But what good does it do to engage economically if the result is simply a massive transfer of American capital and wealth to communist China? American capital and wealth, by the way, which is then used to finance a rapid military buildup aimed at driving America out of Asia.
This is still very relevant to the last couple of videos I've made this week, talking about certain people in the finance industry that like to promote China. Now, whether you think that they're right or wrong, the problem here is our ally and some of the most powerful people within the White House think they are. They're not going to be allowed to spend Australian dollars in China and invest it in China anymore. And I will tell you one more thing. If they continue to do so, the Australian government may do something. And if they continue to do that, even though the Australian government has warned them not to, the CIA might pay them a visit.
If we have learned anything from the concentration camps in Xinjiang, the crushing of democracy in Hong Kong, the cultural genocide in Tibet, the organ harvesting from live Falun Gong prisoners, the infanticide spawned by China's one-child policy, and the brutal suppression of Christianity, it is this: America and the rest of the world must never, ever fall under the thumb, boot, or influence of the Chinese Communist Party. And that is why it is so critical to stand up to the CCP. Here, I must be very clear now about one critical point. Standing up to Communist China does not mean going to war. This is the very last thing the Trump administration wants. All President Trump has ever sought is prosperity for the American people and peace in this beautiful but often far too violent world. Nearly 4 years after he assumed the office of the presidency, the world is a much safer place. President Trump is bringing home our troops from the Middle East and Afghanistan. He has increased calm and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Our European allies are paying a much fairer share of the cost of NATO, and the result is a much stronger alliance against Russia. And President Trump has brokered the first peace agreements with Israel in the Middle East in more than 25 years, along with an historic pact between Kosovo and Serbia, achievements for which he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Just as we do not want kinetic war with China, China most surely does not want a military conflict with America. As the Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu once noted long ago, to win 100 victories in 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. This is the goal of the CCP, to take the riches of America without firing a shot, and do so not just through its economic warfare and 7 deadly sins, but also through its ultra-modern information warfare and attacks on our political system, and a supremely cynical kind of lawfare that seeks to leverage institutions like the United Nations to promote Communist China's quest for global domination. On the information warfare front, Chinese Communist Party agents regularly prowl and troll our social media. Their near-term goal is to help defeat Donald J. Trump.
Yeah, I see it a lot on this channel. They come and troll me all the time.
Their broader strategic goal is to convince the world that Communist China's authoritarian political and social systems and command and control economy are far superior to an American exceptionalism built upon free markets, free persons, democratic elections, the rule of law, and an independent judiciary. Regrettably, far too many of the American media, with their blatant hyper-partisanship, are helping to advance this corrosive and toxic CCP narrative. In doing so, far too many American journalists today are merely serving as what Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin viewed as useful idiots for the CCP. Deng Xiaoping, China.
Actually, I got an email from one of you guys mentioning Yuri Bergenov or whatever. He calls them ideological idiots.
His paramount leader during the 1970s once said, "Seek truth from facts." Yet both truth and facts are in short supply these days in both the Chinese and American media. Here it is taken as a given that the Chinese press and government publications like the People's Daily and Global Times are simply propaganda organs for the CCP. Yet, increasingly, and this truly is our national disgrace, it is likewise taken as a given that our own American media are propagandists as well. In 1972, a Gallup poll found that 2/3 of Americans trusted the news media. Today, that number is down to 41%, with only 15% of Republicans and 36% of independents trusting the media. Astonishingly, nearly 1/3 of the American people have no trust whatsoever in the media. How can a free and democratic political system possibly survive if the media we rely upon to bring us the truth and facts are hopelessly divided along partisan lines and simply dedicated to partisan factoids and spin? If the media were equally divided along partisan lines, that would be one set of facts. But clearly, this is not the case. A Pew poll found that in the first 60 days of the Trump administration, fully 2/3 of the news stories were negative. That was more than twice the negativity seen in stories from the first 60 days of the presidencies of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. The mainstream media has only gone further downhill since. One study in 2018 showed that 92% of the evening news coverage of the Trump administration was negative. 92%. Every morning that CNN starts its new day parroting the Democrat talking points, or MSNBC starts with its incessant and bileless Trump bashing, communist China wins and American democracy loses. What is the difference between China's Global Times attacking the Trump administration and endorsing Joe Biden for president, and outlets like CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, and the Amazon Post effectively doing the same thing? This devolution of America's fourth estate into partisan hacks and Democrat super PACs is not just an existential threat to our eternal American quest towards a more perfect union. The rise of a partisan fake news conglomerate, and this is what the mainstream media misses, also provides aid, comfort, and assistance to a Chinese Communist Party intent on setting the American sun in Asia. The New York Times, the Amazon Post, CNN, MSNBC, even outlets once beyond reproach like 60 Minutes, PBS, and Frontline have devolved into nothing more than attack dogs for the Democratic Party and useful idiots for the Chinese Communist Party. The American media are not, however, the only useful idiots promoting Communist China's agenda. Take the National Basketball Association and its hypocritical virtue signaling. Its star players and coaches are as quick to take a knee during the national anthem and denounce this country as racist as they are to get lockjaw as soon as the thorny subjects of Communist China's horrific human rights abuses and brutal takedown of Hong Kong's democracy.
Shocking. It really is shocking. And I get it. This is Republican, right-wing Trump talking points. I get it.
Are raised. We've seen these cowards shut up and dribble in China, even as they insist on selling jerseys and sneakers made in Chinese sweatshops back to America's children. When our professional athletes refuse to stand and pledge allegiance to our flag and honor those in a different kind of uniform who have lost their lives in defense of America's freedom, communist China wins and American democracy loses. A recent Harris poll shows that the American people have seen right through the hypocrisy in Lakerland and Kerrville. Nearly 40% of sports fans say the NBA has become too political, ratings have plummeted, and fully 20% of fans say the NBA's blind eye to communist China is a reason. Many of the moguls who run Hollywood studios, along with far too many Hollywood stars, are likewise useful idiots for the Chinese Communist Party. When Hollywood moguls release yet another movie that quite literally airbrushes the abuses of the CCP, authoritarian China once again wins and self-censored American democracy loses. On this troubling issue of self-censorship, the Chinese Communist Party is clearly not holding a gun to the head of LeBron James or the chairman of Disney, demanding that they stay silent on the CCP's horrific abuses. Instead, these craven, useful idiots simply know that unless they keep their mouths shut and turn heroes like Daryl Morey into unemployed pariahs, they will lose out on the profits that otherwise might be made in the world's largest Orwellian prison. And this
type of talk is happening in Australia right now. I just want you guys to be aware of that.
Useful idiots of the NBA and Hollywood are not alone in their cowardly self-censorship. American reporters in Beijing regularly pull their punches, covering China's House of Human Rights horrors for fear of losing their visas. Silicon Valley investors and Wall Street hedge fund managers zip their lips to keep the spigot open for a flood of Chinese cash. And our nation's colleges and universities are so addicted to the tuition money and research grants that pour in from Chinese students and destructive spy programs like Thousand Talents and Confucius Institutes that they turn two blind eyes to the espionage that regularly occurs.
Like what happened to Drew Pavlau in University of Queensland?
On their campuses. While the mainstream media, Hollywood moguls, financial elites, and America's NBA are playing useful idiots all too well in a four corners defense of globalism and the Democrat Party, the most dangerous useful idiots for the Chinese Communist Party may well be the anarchists, agitators, and looters now regularly crossing state lines to invade our Democrat-run and run into the ground cities. The phrase organized anarchists may seem like an oxymoron, but that is exactly what we are witnessing in the radical left's America. When Antifa and BLM stormtroopers swarm with military precision into Portland or Chicago or Kenosha, dressed in body armor and armed with brass knuckles, frozen water bottles, and mace, ready to loot and burn, they not only destroy businesses and livelihoods, they are destroying everything that is sacred about the tradition of American peaceful protest. Communist China, authoritarianism wins. American democracy once again loses. When angry cancel culture mobs tear down or vandalize statues of great Americans like Thomas Jefferson, Ulysses S. Grant, Francis Scott Key, and Frederick Douglass, American history loses, and a Chinese communist-style cultural revolution wins. When boorish thugs go up to peaceful citizens trying to enjoy a meal and shout at them and threaten them and take their food and drink their water? They are tearing at the very fabric of our society and democracy. American civility loses and communist Chinese thought control wins. Do these thieves, vandals, and radical miscreants not understand or even care that during this pandemic, the whole world is not just watching? Citizens around the world are weighing and measuring the effectiveness of our American democracy. And the Chinese Communist Party is doing everything it can to compare the apparent chaos in America to the illusion of stability in Beijing and Shanghai, and even now in Hong Kong.
BLM protesters. I won't say publicly what is really going on, but if you're willing to have a beer with me or a coffee, I will explain to you what I think really happened with the BLM protesters. That's all I'm going to say.
And those Democrats who control the government of Washington, D.C. are considering renaming or tearing down the Washington Monument and Jefferson Memorial underscores just how useless these idiots are to our own country. Here again, American democracy loses and communist China wins. Here's what we should fear. With so much of the fabric of America's economy, educational system, financial institutions, sports and entertainment world, journalism, political system under siege from what is a systematic effort by the Chinese Communist Party to advance its own authoritarian narrative, we may soon reach a tipping point here in America. At such a point, it may well be that those who finally deliver the coup de grace to American democracy, economic prosperity, and national sovereignty may well come not from outside our borders, but from those useful idiots right here in America who choose to put profits, partisanship, and radical ideology before God, country, and freedom. Beyond Communist China's economic aggression and information warfare, there is also Communist China's systematic attack against our rules-based international order. The hallmark of the CCP's so-called lawfare is to break international rules when it suits its strategic objectives and use or bend those rules when it is in the CCP's interest. We know firsthand just how far things can go wrong, for example, when Communist China is able to exert control over a UN agency. It was the UN's World Health Organization and China's puppet, Director General Tedros, that helped the CCP hide the dangers of a novel and lethal coronavirus from the world for more than 2 devastating months. Time enough for a deadly CCP pandemic to take hold and shake the world. Here it cannot be said too often that the CCP and the WHO lied and people around the world have died. And no American should ever forget the following history. On January 15, 2020, President Trump welcomed a delegation of high-ranking trade officials from China to sign a Phase 1 trade deal. This historic event appeared to be a great leap forward in U.S.-China trade relations. However, we now know that at the time, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, as well as other high-ranking Chinese Communist Party officials, were all well aware that a deadly virus was ravaging China and had the clear potential to cause a global pandemic through human-to-human transmission. Despite the obvious and immediate dangers this virus posed to America and the world, none of this potentially life-saving information was transmitted to President Trump or anyone at the White House. Instead, these Chinese Communist Party officials simply smiled at us, ate our food, shook our hands, and signed the Phase 1 trade deal. In their silence, Xi Jinping and the CCP put President Trump, Vice President Pence and numerous White House senior staff and administration officials, all in grave danger. Since that time, we've learned many things about the deadly CCP virus. We know that it originated in Wuhan, China, sometime in November. We know that during December and January, the CCP hid the virus and its potential for human-to-human transmission from the world with the help of the World Health Organization. We know that as the CCP hid the virus, China vacuumed up much of the world's supplies of personal protective equipment. We know Communist China's hoarding was tantamount to criminal manslaughter because this hoarding denied desperately needed PPE to healthcare workers at the front lines of the pandemic in cities from Milan to New York. Most egregious, we know that even as all of China was being locked down to domestic travel, the CCP was freely permitting tens of thousands of Chinese nationals potentially infected with the virus to fly to major cities around the world, thereby virtually guaranteeing a global pandemic. Of course, President Trump courageously put a stop to such travel to the United States on January 31st. And he would then be called a xenophobe for making a decision that likely saved hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of American lives. We also know that as we race at warp speed to manufacture a vaccine, Chinese cyber hackers are scurrilously trying to steal our scientific research. We know, too, that as the CCP's virus ravages the globe, Communist China is trying to use the pandemic to advance both its authoritarian political model and its strategic and geopolitical objectives. Under cover of a plague that would force peaceful protesters into their homes, Communist China has crushed democracy in the empty streets of Hong Kong. Just as it did during the chaos and distraction of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Communist China once again invaded India in a bold attempt to annex more territory. And the CCP is even trying to horse trade with the Philippines priority access to a vaccine in exchange for not interfering with China's militarization of the South China Sea. These CCP actions are not only aberrant behavior in the international order, they are abhorrent. In closing, let me say that there are two things we know to be certain. First, the American people want to know where the CCP virus originated from. The CCP must stop hiding this information from the free world. Second, the American people want Communist China to be held fully accountable for the trillions of dollars in costs and tragic loss of human life its deadly CCP virus has inflicted upon America.
He's calling it the CCP virus. I'd rather him call it the Chinese flu or the Chinese virus, like what Trump said in the very beginning.
And that bill must one day come due. At the end of such a speech, it's traditional to offer a long list of policy prescriptions to the wide range of threats the CCP now poses to the American nation. I'm going to break with that tradition and simply say that the problem here is not about knowing what to do. Rather, it is having the national will and unity to do what we know must be done. In the spirit of such unity, I call on all Americans, and particularly all of America's now useful idiots for the Chinese Communist Party, to rise to the most important occasion of our time. We as a nation have a fight of our lives on our hands, and we cannot keep fighting amongst each other if we are to prevail. For just as Great Britain once faced a choice between the appeasement of Neville Chamberlain and the steel spine of Winston Churchill in the face of fascism, concentration camps, and authoritarian repression, so too does America face a choice between appeasing Communist China, as the globalist elites would have us do, or holding China and the CCP accountable for its actions, as economic nationalism demands. Thank you today for listening and watching, And I'm delighted now to sit down with one of my favorite folks and scholars in the world here, the esteemed Michael Pillsbury.
There were quite a few talking points. It really did sound like we were listening to Steve Bannon.
Water. Thank you, Dr. Navarro. That's a major address with many points, some newsworthy, some, to use a cliche, food for thought for the long term. Why don't I try to pick up on 2 or 3 of your major themes and draw you out about how we could have success in what I take to be your major challenge, how to go from useful idiot to national unity. And the first question I'd ask you in that regard is, I think that Ronald Reagan, President Donald Trump, you and me all have something very unusual in common about our politics. All 4 of us were once Democrats. As I read about you in the New York Times, you ran at least 4 times as a Democrat in San Diego. I was actually a registered Democrat and ran for the Democratic National Convention in 1976 to support Senator Henry Jackson, a kind of hawk of the Soviet Union. So there may be hope for useful idiots and Democrats to change their minds about China and not be the kind of force that serves China's interests in our country that you're talking about. So the question would be, how do you visualize this process going forward? Where some of the examples you gave of the NBA or Hollywood producers, or I still stuck on the word craven. You used the word craven, useful idiots.
Yeah.
How could some of, obviously financial Wall Street investment firms are deeply committed to China. How do you visualize these people as a group shifting the way we all did from being Democratic Party members? When I say we, I mean Trump, Reagan, Navarro, and Pillsbury, and many millions of others. How could this shift take place? Because one possibility is Chinese behavior is going to be more and more extreme. And so it'll just become impossible for the friends of China, as the Chinese themselves call it, it'll become impossible for the friends of China inside our country to continue to be useful idiots. So could Chinese conduct getting worse be one of the factors that changes all this? Because I noticed you did say in the beginning that despite all that President Trump has done, China is still continuing, even getting, I think you used the word, more emboldened than before. So this implies to me we're going to have not only national unity and the conversion of the useful idiots, we're also going to have stronger measures going forward to try to change Chinese behavior. Is this possible? Do you think both of us are being too optimistic that China will ever stop? Are we looking at the next leader of the world and there's not much we can do about it?
Well, let's, the theme here is...
That's a loaded question, but it makes perfect sense looking at the context here. And over the last couple of days, I've covered a few what I would deem to be useful idiots within Australia.
That we as a country have to unify around a common threat from outside our borders. Mm-hmm. We used to have a tradition in this country, in our political system, that politics stopped at the border. That when it came to foreign conflicts, foreign tensions, that we united as a country. When I talk about...
It's no longer the case, and it's no longer the case in Australia. Australia is just as divided. We just haven't seen the sparks yet.
Unity, we have to be clear-eyed about this. We as a country are never going to be unified about a lot of things. There are things like choice versus life. There are things like the right to bear arms versus gun control. Mm-hmm. There's big government versus small government. These are these are issues as to why we have elections. And that's a good and powerful thing. But what's happened is in the partisan fight over these primarily domestic issues, we've lost sight of this broader threat. One might even say existential threat that's bearing down on us. And so what I'm trying to do today.
It's not an existential threat for the United States. It is for Australia, though. It really is.
Here is raise awareness that a lot of what's happening for partisan reasons in the mainstream media, in professional sports, in Hollywood, in Silicon Valley, on Wall Street, is unwittingly dividing this nation in a way which advances the Chinese Communist Party's agenda. And the hope here, and it's the triumph of hope over experience, because we are where we are. The hope here is that people in America, in our elite institutions, will finally wrap their head around the dangers. I mean, I come from a university environment, right? For years, I watched the Chinese money flood in to academia for two purposes. One, to advance the Chinese narrative, and two, steal our treasures. Mm-hmm. And yet that money just kept coming in. So anyway, that's my thought. It's like, I think, seek truth from facts. And what I'm trying to do is put out some facts here and hope that we get to the truth and therefore political change. But, it's a tough slog here.
Well, I want to pick up on one word you used. I think it's an adverb. Unwittingly.
Unwittingly.
Yeah. That it's not as though the useful idiots or those who serve China's interests in our country have necessarily thought things through thoroughly, read all of your books and all of my books, and then made a conscious decision. I'm going to work for China. When you say unwittingly, it implies that the role of education could be important going forward. So I wanted to get your reaction to some developments that I think are very positive. Hudson is not the only think tank that's become deeply interested in the China problem. We have a brother-sister think tank, which I really admire what they've been doing recently in the last couple of years. It's called Center for New American Security. And a lot of Vice President Biden's advisors sort of come out of there. They've issued a number of really strong reports on the China problem. They even call it the total competitive threat. There's another set of activities going on in the Congress. About a month ago, the New York Times had a long article on 7 senators, all Democrats, who put forward a 10-year program, $350 billion total amount of money. Senator Menendez of New Jersey on foreign relations was in the lead. They tended to be the ranking Democrats on the top 6 committees in the Senate. And I read through this proposal. It's actually a piece of legislation. It's very detailed. It has many of the points you're making today, and some others as well. They want to train journalists, for example, to recognize Chinese information warfare manipulation. They want more funds for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative to increase our allies and partners' military preparedness in the Pacific. So it's quite a comprehensive.
Interesting.
Piece of legislation. And I noticed that one of the key Republicans, Chairman Jim Risch of Idaho, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, he praised it. He didn't dump on it and say, this is terrible, Democrats are idiots. He praised it and said this could become the basis of bipartisan cooperation. Another data point was in January in Munich, when after both Mark Esper and Mike Pompeo made their speeches on China, mainly on China, Nancy Pelosi gave her speech. And a stunned reporter asked Nancy Pelosi, it sounds like you're agreeing with the Trump administration on China policy. And she basically said yes. So there seems to be a trend in the direction of bipartisan cooperation. But do you think that
It's bipartisan, definitely. And all America's allies behind the scenes are being warned that they better toe the line, not only by helping with all of the big strategic things that we need to be doing, which happened a year and a half ago, by the way, but domestically as well?
this is just a moment which will not last? Or do you see some reason for optimism in bipartisan unity toward China? Because your speech tended to be very negative.
Here's what I know. I know that Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, for decades have talked tough on China.
On trade issues. But we never got anything really done. It's about walking the talk. And the difference between Donald J. Trump and everybody else who has preceded him, there's really two differences. One is he got here without being the tool of corporate America. He didn't need their money, and he was untethered from the ladder that most of these politicians go up from. So he has done what he thinks is best in the national interest, and the record speaks for itself. He stood up to China. But you mentioned, a think tank. I'm sure they do great work, and I'm heartened that they're sending some people out who are possibly going to be tough on China to talk to Joe Biden. But as long as you raise this issue, remember that the fish rots from the head up, or the head down. I'm not sure what you mean.
And the problem here is, if you look, for example, at a guy like Kurt Campbell, back in the Obama administration, when Campbell worked with Hillary Clinton to engineer what? You know what I'm talking about?
Sure.
The pivot to Asia. Now, as a practical matter, what happened was, and we know this from recent news coming out of the so-called and alleged Biden crime family scandal, that Joe Biden was entrusted with executing the pivot strategy, including backing China, communist China, down from militarizing the South China Sea. And there was that famous event in the beautiful Rose Garden at the White House, where the General Secretary Xi Jinping came there, shook Barack Obama's hand, shook Joe Biden's hand, promised that they would both stop hacking our computers and stop militarizing the South China Sea. Now, subsequent to that,
and came and gave a speech in Canberra, in Australia, and told the Australian people that we're all good friends. We're all good friends. I'll cover that on this channel too. Let's watch the speech that Xi Jinping gave together. We'll watch that over the next week or two.
Biden goes to China. He takes his kid with him. And when Joe Biden gets back, there's a reversal essentially on our policy of the pivot, where there's no follow through. We get nothing done on that. And Hunter's got $1 billion worth of money to go buy defense-related companies in Michigan for China and ship them over to China. So I take your point, but I think it's not parties that make policy and change, it's people. And what we need are people on both sides of the aisle in politics. But we also need, I can't stress this, the need to have people in journalism who are willing to see this bigger picture. I've been rereading Pat Buchanan's book on the Nixon administration and his experience there. And it was not unlike today, where you had a hostile media to the Nixon administration. You had protesters in the streets. You had these conflicts, to your question earlier, between the American people over issues that are of domestic politics, and that was a fight worth having. Okay, and we could fight within the nation and not damage our American democracy. In fact, we strengthened it at that time. That's not what we're doing here. We're fighting in a way where the news media is just, to me, it's out of control. That puffball debate we had on one network with Joe Biden and the fastball hardballs that they had on the other with President Trump, to me, was like a microcosm of just how the playing field has been so distorted in a way which, again, we're losing sight of the fact that communist China wins. Every time the NBA shut up and dribbles, they win. Every time Silicon Valley takes a bunch of new Chinese cash for the IPO and lets the IP, the intellectual property, go over to China, we lose. And I fear for our democracy here. This is why I'm here. This place really is at the forefront
The Hudson
of
Institute.
thought
Okay.
about these matters, and it's time to have a national dialogue. Look, here's the American.
It's far worse in Australia, people. It is far worse in Australia. It's out of control in Australia. If they think it's bad in America, so much worse here.
People get this, okay? If you look at the Pew poll, Pew does like honest work, right? And you just look at the trajectory of the American people who think that China is a significant threat.
Continues to
It's
go
like
up.
a ski slope up in Vermont. It's just boom. And if you're in Michigan, or if you're in Wisconsin, or if you're in Pennsylvania, you've seen the Chinese come in and devastate first your factories and your jobs, and then next your communities with the opioids and fentanyl. People out there in America, this is not America, this is the swamp here, okay? But you go to the Iron Range in Duluth, you go to the Antrim Shale Formation in Michigan, where there's fracking employing 50,000 people. You go to the cranberry bogs in Wisconsin. You go to the Pride of Clyde in Ohio, where they make washing machines. You go to Pennsylvania in the Philly shipyard. Every one of those places has benefited from Trump economic policy in a way which never would have happened under the alternative. And those places are still having to fight back from the hole that communist China dug them in by entering the WTO, the World Trade Organization, with the vote of people like Joe Biden and Bill Clinton and a bunch of Republicans. And it's time right now to have the epiphany that stuff's got to stop.
It seems to me that the Republican Party for many decades had a position of so-called free trade.
Yeah.
And it was almost like religious faith, that any single tariff,
it was faith.
It
was a praise the Lord faith.
But my impression is, and this is back to your Harvard economics PhD.
Yes.
My impression is all of this was.
I taught that Ricardian model. I know just how flawed it is.
This was all based on the economists.
Yes.
Who somehow believed it and found data to support it. So is it fair to say now that our economists have begun to change their views? And so that when they see a predatory, mercantilist China, they don't anymore say, well, gee, free trade will solve this problem, free trade and patience. Are economists now focusing more on the damage caused by a predatory, mercantilist state that's almost the same size as our GDP? Because it seems to me if economists sounded the warning, Nobel Prize winning economists sounded the warning, maybe the New York Times and the Washington Post would follow because they'd be differential to Nobel Prize winning economists. This is your field.
Yeah. So
I was not an economist.
Look, I think that there's at least a little bit more clear-eyed view of the hazards of free trade. I mean, free trade, the free trade model, the Ricardian model, it's like hundreds of years old based on a world that never even existed back then in terms of the model.
We always hear Adam Smith as the founder.
Adam Smith, David Ricardo, David Hume.
If you have a close look at Adam Smith's life story, I think it is far more important than Adam Smith and the Invisible Hand and how he talked about free trade. Adam Smith ended up being a mercantilist in his later years. Now, I just want to throw, I don't have a PhD in economics, obviously, but I just want to throw my 2 cents in. Free trade only works when you have an economic advantage or an absolute advantage in economic terms. Once you lose that, you have no choice but to play the game and become mercantilist and become pretty much a gangster. Now, the United States has lost that advantage. China has an absolute advantage over almost every country on planet Earth. So that's where we're headed. And it's been like that for ages. It's been like that for, well, we're talking about 12 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And you taught comparative advantage.
You taught this at university
courses. It's like here's the thing. It's like in my profession, right? If there's 100 economists in a room, there's probably only like 3 or 4 of them who are actually trade economists, right? The rest of them learn trade a little bit as part of their training, and they have this ideological affinity for free trade, free markets, and all that. The complication in the world, of course, is that this country has the lowest tariffs in the world, the lowest non-tariff barriers in the world, and we get our clocks cleaned. And it manifests as a big trade deficit, which basically is a shorthand for all the jobs and factories that get shipped offshore. I mean, what sense is it for Europe to charge tariffs on autos 4 times higher than we do? What sense is it for India, I call them the Maharaja of tariffs, to have tariffs that are like triple digits on just product after product after product? But the bigger problem with China that I don't think my profession's ever going to be able to wrap their heads around is that with China, it's an issue far beyond trade, right? It's like when we were negotiating the deal with China, which they backed away from, right? It wasn't so much about trade. It was about those 7 deadly sins. The idea that they're stealing our intellectual property, which down the road means we'll be less prosperous, things like that. And then you add on to that these geopolitical and national security issues. Like, how do you deal? I mean, there's very few people in my profession who can wrap their heads around militarization in the South China Sea. And there's probably not a lot of them who think a lot about the loss of democracy in Hong Kong and what that might mean for civilization, much less the financial.
Or the Uyghurs.
Yeah, or the Uyghurs.
It's not an economic issue.
Yeah, so that's why the kind of stuff you write, Mike, is so important, because it gets out there this bigger context for what's going on here. But I mean, we'll, as the president likes to say, we'll see what happens. But the one thing I can tell you is that the world needs people like Donald Trump, because he's one of the few people who's willing to stand up to China. He's willing to do that. And as far as I can see, most of the alternatives are compromised. They either compromise or they don't see the big picture.
Yeah. Very few in the finance industry in Australia see the big picture. They only see short-term profits. And they're very selfish. Same in the Australian media. But it's slowly turning around in Australia, slowly, piece by piece. Yeah, for years I was reading a lot of just outrageous comments. I just was like, don't you guys see what's happening? I found solace in listening to these guys years ago because they got it. When the even friends of mine, they literally thought I was crazy. It's a little bit. It's interesting how how people have these internal biases and they're not able to think outside the box, even when it's not so much thinking outside of the box. The most obvious things right in front of them, and even if it's pointed out to them, they're brainwashed by these societal norms, and someone tells them something and they get brainwashed so easily. I obviously think for myself, one of the few that decided to take action on this channel. It's good to see things are changing, but I fear that we're so late in the game, so slow to catch up to what was going on.
Maybe I should raise another issue that your speech causes some concern in my own thinking about the next 10 or 15 years. As we went into the Cold War, which I only read about in history books, I noticed that the United States under Harry Truman made a lot of changes in its institutions to deal with the Soviet Union and the Cold War. We created the CIA. By law, we created the National Security Council. We created the U.S. Air Force. A whole series of institutions were created to deal with the Soviet challenge or Soviet threat. And it was done quite consciously. Yeah. White House memos, and then legislation being passed, and then new organizations being set up that didn't exist before. Now, I've seen some proposals like that from the Congress. One I know you know about is Marco Rubio and others, and lots of Democrats, supporting a technology czar in the White House, that we don't take protection of our technology seriously enough. Sure, Commerce Department has a role, Treasury has CFIUS, intelligence communities looking for examples of technology theft. But until it really becomes an organization, often our government bureaucracy doesn't take something very seriously. Do you think we're in that kind of situation going forward, that we're going to have to think about new institutions that focus on China? Or can the current swamp?
This reminds me of Joe Biden on the campaign trail saying he's going to form an office of trade and manufacturing, and I go, oh, did that 4 years ago? But we have the Office of Technology Policy at the White House, run by an extremely capable guy in Michael Kratsios. Look, I know you talk about Marco Rubio. It's like he's doing great stuff. Rubio's doing great stuff. Josh Hawley's doing great stuff. Tom Cotton's doing great stuff. Schumer's making kind of the right noises. But here's the problem. It's like the House of Representatives turns Democrat in 2018, and they spend 2 years doing what? No legislation, just these like crazy investigations that went nowhere for all just partisan purposes, and they dragged American society and political system into the muck. My point here, again, getting back to the theme of the speech, is that these useful idiots have to understand that there actually are important problems in the world which we have to unify politically against. And if we don't do that, so it's for me it's like people.
The amount of useless idiots in Australia, wow, they have outnumbered the real Australians for years. Well, pretty much my entire life.
People make policy, okay? And you can put all the institutions wrapped around this and make change, whatever. But until people on Capitol Hill are willing to do what's necessary in order to address the China threat, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And until the media turns away from spin, partisanship, and being like a super PAC for the Democrat Party, and turns back to Deng Xiaoping. I hate to quote a Chinese communist, but it'd be nice for them to seek truth from facts for a change.
Let me ask you the last question, which is maybe one you don't want to answer, but you raised it in your remarks, and I think it's the most important thing right now about China. You mentioned the need to hold China accountable for the virus.
Yes.
The president himself has mentioned several times, usually in the future tense, that China will be held accountable in the future. In other words, the steps he's taken in the last 6 or 8 months are not holding China accountable. Do you have any concept
For the virus.
For the virus.
Yeah.
Do you have any concept of where the president could go in terms of holding China accountable for the virus? The one example I've seen so far in terms of co-sponsors in the Senate, Martha Blackburn, Josh Hawley, quite a few have supported it, is the idea of being able to sue the Chinese government using Libya and the Pan Am bombing as the precedent.
Yeah.
That for $10 million per human life, you take that times so far 200,000 for us, 1 million for the whole world. This becomes the bill. This becomes how to hold China accountable. They owe the world for the death of 1 million people, and they have to somehow pay for it. Is that the way?
And this is why they're trying to blame everybody else except for themselves. And that's partially why we're prolonging this lockdown a little bit. That's partially why we had the it's pretty late in the video, not many people listen to this point. This is why the BLM protests were whooped up with a Cambridge Analytica style and this has been on the cards for a very long time. This is why Australia's being hit by China hard, because they know that we're going to seize their assets in every Western country. It's going to happen, and that's connected to us identifying CCP members in our country. We're going to freeze their bank accounts, and that's why, partially why, CCP members are not allowed to leave Australia unless they get up and go home right now. It's all connected.
Right way to think about it, or is it still just not known?
So as an economist, let me
Yes.
just quickly do the numbers
Please.
for you.
I defer to you as an economist.
One of the macabre things that the government does is value a human life, and the price is $10 million. Now, life is priceless, okay? But if you simply take that number and the over 200,000 Americans we've lost, it's a couple $1 trillion. Add that, the trillions of dollars that have been spent.
You notice how silent it is in the room? Everybody wants to hear this.
Phase 1 deal, and through monetary policy, probably gets you up to 8 or 10 trillion. And then you go and you model all of the economic costs of the downturn, the unemployment, the human suffering, and all of that.
Opioid addiction.
I would say that the cost that the Chinese Communist Party has inflicted on America is approaching the loss of a full year of American GDP. Okay,
That's 20 trillion.
now I tell you two things. The American people believe rightly that the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for this virus, and polls show that they want them held accountable. If we are in a Jeffersonian democracy, that should get the attention of both sides of the aisle, and that's going to be a decision that I think is going to get made at some point. It's great to be with you here today, sir.
Thank you for
I
coming to
appreciate the Hudson Institute for having me. I have great admiration for you and this institute.
Thank you.
I think that will be the title of this video. China owes the world $20 trillion. I think I'll name it something like that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Interesting video. Very interesting video. Hope you guys found that interesting. I will definitely be seeing you guys